All right, so I'm going to sum up the last several points on this outline just in this short video. The bulk of this outline that's fun is the soldiers and the nurses. There's some good stuff here too, but this last little bit is really more like where we're headed next. It's kind of the link to our next thing. Two things though. So you've got women as protesters in the war, and then what it meant to be women of color. We've talked about some women of color, right? We talked about Susie King Taylor, Mary Bowser, and of course you're reading Harriet Tubman. But I need to connect some of what's there at the bottom with African American women to where we're headed next after the exam. Okay, so first, women as protesters. I've got two examples for you. Inflation in the South is 9,000%. And usually inflation is a big deal. It's in double digits. In the South, it's 9,000%. So basically, money's worth nothing. And there's a blockade. I mentioned that in reference to women as nurses with Phoebe Yates Pipper. And so they don't have access to really anything. And so in 1863, women show up in Richmond and they begin rioting for bread. They just want to eat. The riot gets dispersed. The president threatens to send in the troops, and ultimately the women leave. There's a handful of riots in other cities, but it's a tangible instance of like women rising up and saying, we're not happy, like this isn't working for us. And so then what they start doing is they start writing letters to husbands, fathers, brothers, basically voicing that same thing and saying they're starving and they're hungry. And they write letters like, if you don't come home now, don't come home because we're all going to be dead. So hopefully, if you are serving in a war and you get a letter from your loved ones telling you that they're starving, and if you don't come home now to help plant food, everybody will be dead, hopefully you go home. And so by the end of the war, 10% of the Confederate forces were deserting. And the Confederacy already is at a huge disadvantage in terms of population. There are 22 million people in the North. There are 9 million people in the South, but 4 million of them are enslaved. So the Confederacy can't really afford to have anybody deserting, and roughly 10% are leaving by the end. There's this really great book called Mothers of Invention by Judith and Faust. And she makes this argument that when women give up on the war's done. And this letter, it's not really a campaign, but I mean, women aren't doing it in a united effort, but they're all doing it individually. And so these letters are going to ultimately help end the war. When women give up on war's done. Now the last thing you have there, African American women in the war, this just shows what a mixed bag this war is. I mean, ultimately it will be freedom, which can't be measured in terms of wins. But getting there is going to be hard. If white people don't have bread, their enslaved peoples aren't eating. And so that's that first point on there, is that people of color will be resisting. They'll realize this war means the end of slavery, but those 4 years are going to be pretty brutal years. Slave owners know their slaves are trying to escape because Union lines are just over there. One woman recalled being chained to a stove for the 4 years of the war. She had enough chain to get herself around the kitchen, but the person who owned her was so terrified of her escaping that she was chained to a stove for 4 years. And then two, again, right, if white people don't have food, black people aren't going to have food. Another thing to think about is that fugitive slave law, which is in the first document, one of the first documents in the Harriet Tubman book. This is actually, it's written as a law before the Constitution, but then it's put into the Constitution that when slaves run away, by law, they're returned to their owner. What it means is there's really no such thing as a free state in the United States. This is why Harriet Tubman, when she helped free people, she did them again because she understood they weren't really free in the United States. And so when the war begins, some commanders don't want to recognize the legitimacy of the Confederacy, so they'll still honor the Fugitive Slave Law. So some white Southerners will wave the white flag and will demand the runaway slaves be returned to them under the Fugitive Slave Law, which is really ironic because it just left the country, decided you didn't want to follow the laws of the country. You create your own country, but now you're going to follow this one law. But so anyway, these Union commanders will then honor the Fugitive Slave Law and return these runaway slaves. And so what one Union commander came up with the idea was contraband of war. And the idea here is even though what they could do is they could say that slaves were contraband. So like usually contraband is horses and buggies and guns. It's like the material of war. But Union commanders could argue that slaves were helping to plant food or helping to move supplies, and so that they could be kept as contraband of war. So this is a great kind of like loophole, but it doesn't recognize people as human. It recognizes them still as property. And women tell pretty horrible stories about the contraband camps of sexual assault, of rape, of hunger. So again, they're free, but the conditions that they're in are pretty awful. And this again gives us some indication maybe where we're headed in this period after the Civil War. Again, we'll look at that after your exam in the next lecture. All right, if you have questions, you can put those in the discussion board. Take care.